Welcome to Founding Chronicles, your window into the hidden and unforgettable stories of history. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a story from our channel. Today, we're taking you back to Jamaica in 1760, to the terrifying and heroic tale of Tacky's rebellion, the slave who slaughtered 60 masters at Jamaica's Easter dawn. A story of courage, defiance, and the unbreakable human spirit. Let's begin. The sun had barely begun its climb over the lush hills of Jamaica, its early light spilling across fields of sugarcane that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was thick with the sweet, almost cloying scent of ripening cane, mixed with the acrid smoke from distant chimneys. It was Easter morning in 1760, a day meant for celebration, for hope, for life. But for the enslaved men and women who worked these lands under the lash of their masters, there was no joy in the air. Only the constant, grinding fear of punishment, the gnawing hunger, the unbearable weight of chains that bound not only their bodies, but their spirits. Among them, one man moved with a fire that few could see, but that burned hotter than the Caribbean sun itself. His name was Tacky. Tacky had not been born on this island, not in the sun-drenched fields that were now his prison. He had been brought across the Atlantic from West Africa, torn from the land of his ancestors, ripped from the lives he had known. But he carried with him a memory, a rhythm of freedom, a heartbeat that refused to be silenced. In the quiet moments, when the overseers' whips were turned elsewhere, when the white planters drank their rum and counted their profits, Tacky would speak to the others in low tones, reminding them of the strength they had inherited from their homelands. The chains were heavy, yes, but not heavy enough to shatter the human spirit entirely. The days leading to Easter had been tense. Whispers had passed from cane field to cane field, from hut to hut. Some spoke of rebellion, some dismissed it as fantasy, a dangerous dream. But Tacky had a plan, and it was not born of anger alone. It was born of justice, the fierce, uncompromising justice of a man who had seen his people crushed, his dignity stripped, and who knew that if he did not act, nothing would ever change. The sugar plantations were merciless, operated under the tight grip of British overseers, who saw the men and women who worked the fields as little more than cattle. Their brutality was not occasional. It was systematic. A missed quota, a whispered complaint, a look deemed disrespectful, all could earn the lash. And yet these men and women endured because survival was all they had left. Tacky moved silently through the rows of cane the night before Easter, gathering the men he trusted most. They were careful, whispering beneath the shadows, sharing words that carried both hope and fear. He spoke of liberation, of striking the masters when they were least prepared, of seizing the day of religious celebration ironically, a day when the masters themselves were distracted by prayers and feasts. The plan was dangerous, nearly impossible, but it burned with a certainty that could not be denied. These men were not simply fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their families, their ancestors, for a future that had never been theirs. When the first light of Easter dawn touched the plantations, Tacky and his small band of conspirators struck. The morning was still, almost eerily, so as if the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the calm shattered. Machetes, hidden under bundles of sugarcane and cloth, were drawn. The element of surprise was complete. The masters, accustomed to obedience, to the silent suffering of their enslaved workforce, were caught entirely off guard. Screams cut through the air, mingling with the morning bird song in a nightmarish symphony. The violence was swift, precise, driven by a rage that had been building for decades. 60 masters would fall that morning, each one a symbol of the cruelty, exploitation, and relentless oppression that had defined the lives of Tacky and his people. It was not mindless slaughter. It was calculated, deliberate. Tacky had studied the routines of the plantations, the weak points in the overseer's vigilance, the paths of escape and attack. Every swing of a machete, every strike, carried the weight of history, the burden of injustice. The plantation grounds, usually so ordered, so controlled, descended into chaos. Fires erupted as torches knocked over lanterns, the thick smoke rising like a shroud over the trembling cane fields. Men and women fled into the hills, guided by Tacky's leadership, their hearts pounding with fear and exhilaration. For the first time, many of them tasted something they had been denied all their lives: the raw, intoxicating sense of agency, of control over their own destiny. The master's cries echoed across the valleys, reaching neighboring estates. Panic spread like wildfire. Some of the enslaved men and women, not involved in the uprising, watched from hidden vantage points, torn between fear of reprisal and the magnetic pull of hope. They saw their captors, the people who had ruled over them, with whip and threat fall to the ground, overpowered by those they had considered powerless. It was a shocking reversal, a moment of profound, almost unbearable clarity. The world they had been forced to accept was not immutable. Chains could be broken. Tyranny could. B challenged Dot, and yet the rebellion carried with it an immediate, tangible cost. Even as Tacky led his followers through the plantations, through the smoke and chaos, he knew that the British would retaliate with a fury unlike anything the island had seen. Rumors had long circulated of the extreme punishments meted out to enslaved people who dared resist. The nights would be filled with fire and blood. The plantations would become hunting grounds. But Tacky's heart did not waver. He understood the stakes, and he also understood that inaction was a death sentence for the soul. Better to die swinging a machete for freedom than to live forever beneath the lash dot through the confusion. Tacky's leadership was undeniable. He moved with purpose, guiding men and women to key points where resistance could be concentrated, where escape could be possible. He had studied maps of the terrain, understood the watercourses, the ridges, the valleys. Every choice he made that morning was precise, every decision born of experience and desperation. For the enslaved, Tacky became more than a leader. He became a symbol, a living embodiment of the rebellion they had long dreamed of but never dared enact. His courage ignited a spark that would spread far beyond that Easter morning, a spark that would echo through the generations. Even as the violence unfolded, a haunting sense of sorrow threaded through the uprising. Tacky knew that the fight for freedom was not simply a matter of anger. It was a matter of survival, of preserving life in a world determined to strip it away. The cries of both the masters and the enslaved mingled in the humid morning air, a terrible reminder of the cost of rebellion. Many would die, some on the spot, others in the relentless pursuit that would follow. And yet there was no turning back. That day, the balance of power, however briefly, had shifted. For a moment, the enslaved were not invisible. They were not silent. They were alive, fully and fiercely, in a way that the plantation had never allowed. By the time the smoke began to clear and the initial chaos subsided, Tacky and his band had made their mark on history. The plantations bore the scars of blood and fire. The masters were stunned, and the enslaved were forever changed. Even those who had not participated in the fighting could feel the tremor of possibility, the subtle but undeniable taste of freedom, however fleeting. Tacky himself stood among the cane, machete in hand, breath ragged, eyes wide with a mix of triumph and sorrow. He had struck a blow not just against individual men, but against the system that had made such violence inevitable. The cost had been high, but the message was clear. The enslaved would not remain silent forever. That Easter dawn, as the sun rose higher and the first colonial reinforcements began to arrive from neighboring estates, Tacky knew that the rebellion was only the beginning. The aftermath would be brutal, the hunt for him and his followers merciless. Yet in that moment, amidst the chaos, he felt a fleeting, extraordinary sense of victory. He had acted, he had fought, and in the act of rebellion, he had reclaimed a fragment of his humanity. The dawn that had seemed so full of promise quickly became a nightmare for Tacky and the men and women who had followed him. The initial shock of the rebellion had stunned the plantation masters, but word traveled fast across the island. By mid-morning, mounted messengers were racing toward the nearest towns, their horses' hooves drumming an urgent warning. A rebellion was underway, led by a man named Tacky. The British colonial authorities moved with a cold, practiced efficiency. Militias were formed, soldiers were dispatched, and white planters rallied together, arming themselves with pistols, cutlasses, and rifles. Every officer knew the stakes. To let a slave rebellion succeed, even in part, was to risk the entire system of control that bound Jamaica's plantations together. For the enslaved, fear mixed with the adrenaline of victory. Some had fled into the dense forests, others had. Hidden among the cane, their breaths shallow, hearts racing with terror and exhilaration. They had seen men who had ruled over them with cruelty fall under the force of Tacky's leadership. But now the tables had turned. The hunters were coming. The soldiers and militia were organized, merciless, and driven by a mixture of fear and rage. The safety of the cane fields, the quiet solitude of the hills, would not protect them for long. Tacky moved quickly, guiding his followers through hidden paths known only to the island's enslaved population. He was relentless in his vigilance, aware that one misstep could mean capture and certain death. He pushed them onward, through marshes and thick underbrush, moving toward the higher ridges, where the colonial soldiers would have difficulty following. At night, they rested in hidden clearings, sharing whispers of hope, memories of Africa, and prayers for strength. Each face bore a mix of exhaustion, fear, and determination. They were tired, hungry, terrified, but alive and in this rebellion. Survival meant more than mere existence. It meant reclaiming dignity that had been stripped for generations. The colonial response was swift and brutal. Troops scoured the plantations, burning huts, interrogating those who had not fled, whipping confessions from terrified enslaved men and women. The planters believed that by instilling terror, they could crush any notion of further rebellion. Yet Tacky and his followers had vanished like ghosts into the dense, mountainous interior. Every step they took, every night they survived, was a defiance of a system built to suppress them entirely. Among the enslaved, the rebellion ignited a complex storm of emotions. Some were inspired, eager to join the fight, drawn to Tacky's charisma and courage. Others were paralyzed by fear, torn between the hope of freedom and the certainty of punishment. Families were separated as men and women fled in different directions, some guided by Tacky, others trying to find their own path to safety. The cries of loved ones, the sound of burning huts, the gunshots echoing through the hills all left indelible marks on their psyches. And yet, amidst the terror, there was also a sense of liberation. The very act of rebellion, even in the face of almost certain death, had reminded them that they were not mere property. They were human, and in that truth lay an unquenchable fire. Tacky's leadership was tested as never before. Each day brought new dangers. Scouts reported the approach of militias. The sound of distant cannon fire reminded them that the British were methodical, that they would not rest until the rebellion was extinguished. Yet Tacky refused to show fear. He moved among his followers, offering reassurance, instructing them on how to evade capture, reminding them of the strength they carried within themselves. In these moments, he was more than a leader. He was a beacon, a living embodiment of resistance against a world that had sought to crush him. The pursuit was relentless. Soldiers combed every ridge and valley, burning cane fields and villages suspected of harboring rebels. The enslaved population lived under a suffocating tension. Even those who had not joined the rebellion were hunted, interrogated, and punished. The fear was palpable, yet so was the courage. The memory of Tacky's strike lingered in every hut and field. Every planter who had survived the initial massacre knew that the rebellion could not be ignored. The fear it planted in their hearts ensured that the colonial authorities pursued it with a fanaticism that would leave scars on the island for generations. Tacky's band was small, but it was highly disciplined. They moved with precision, using the terrain to their advantage. They knew where the rivers slowed, where the ridges offered cover, where the thick underbrush could conceal them from the colonial forces. Every decision carried the weight of survival. Every night spent under the open sky, listening to the distant sound of horses and gunfire, reminded them that freedom came at an immense cost. Yet they pressed onward. The rebellion had ignited something in them that fear could not extinguish. Idea that even in the most oppressive circumstances, humans could rise, could fight, could reclaim a measure of their stolen lives. As the days passed, the consequences of the rebellion became starkly apparent. Families were torn apart, plantations lay in ruins, and a wave of panic swept through the white population of Jamaica. Tacky's name became synonymous with fear and defiance. Every story told by the survivors of the initial attack added to his legend. Children whispered of his bravery, elders spoke of his cunning, and the enslaved, who had been too terrified to join, still carried the memory of what had been achieved. Tacky had done something that had seemed impossible. He had reminded an entire population that the oppressive system was not unassailable. That courage could topple even the most entrenched tyranny. Yet the rebellion was also marked by tragedy. The British and colonial militias responded with a ferocity designed to crush hope entirely. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Men and women were captured, whipped, executed, or sold to distant plantations where escape would be impossible. Tacky knew that every decision he made placed his followers in mortal danger, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily upon him. Every moment of survival carried with it the bitter knowledge that many would not make it through the coming days. And still, he pressed forward. The fire that drove him, the fire of justice, of vengeance, of liberation, would not be extinguished by fear alone. Amid the relentless pursuit, Tacky reflected on the nature of freedom itself. He understood that the dream he fought for might not be fully realized in his lifetime. But the act of resistance, the sheer defiance of his actions, was a form of freedom in itself. Even as the soldiers closed in, even as villages burned and lives were lost, he knew that the spark he had ignited would continue to burn in the hearts of those who survived. History, he understood, was not only written by victories, but also by acts of courage that refused to be forgotten. And so, through the smoke-filled valleys and the dense, treacherous hills, Tacky pressed onward, leading his people through a world that had been designed to destroy them. Each day was a test, each night a battle for survival. But the rebellion had done more than challenge the masters. It had transformed the enslaved themselves. It had shown them that the chains that bound their bodies could not bind their spirits. It had shown them that courage, even against overwhelming odds, could produce moments of extraordinary human triumph. And it had shown them that one man, guided by determination, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of justice, could shake the very foundations of an empire built on human suffering. The days stretched into nights filled with tension, every moment a precarious balance between survival and capture. Tacky and his followers had become shadows in the dense Jamaican hills, slipping silently through underbrush, scaling ridges, and crossing rivers with the careful precision of men and women who knew the stakes. The British forces, relentless and methodical, combed the landscape with a fury born of fear and vengeance. Word of the rebellion had spread beyond the immediate plantations. Townsfolk, militia, and colonial officials alike were gripped by panic. Every village, every hut became suspect. Every enslaved person was eyed with suspicion. And yet, amidst the growing danger, Tacky pressed onward, refusing to allow despair to settle over his people. The early victories had given him confidence, but he understood the stakes with absolute clarity. Each day brought the threat of betrayal, the potential of being surrounded, the knowledge that a misstep could cost dozens of lives. He studied the patterns of the colonial troops, anticipating their moves, guiding his followers along paths hidden from the untrained eye. Streams that seemed impassable became lifelines. Ridges that appeared barren provided cover and vantage points. Every decision was life or death. He was not just leading a rebellion. He was orchestrating survival against an enemy equipped with guns, horses, and the merciless will of a colonial system built to crush resistance. But even as he strategized and led, Tacky could not escape the human cost of what he had begun. Exhaustion etched itself onto every face he passed. Hunger gnawed at stomachs already weakened by long marches and constant vigilance, and fear threaded through every heartbeat. Children huddled against mothers, wives clung to husbands, and the elderly struggled to keep pace. The rebellion, for all its promise, was exacting a toll that Tacky could not ignore. At night, around small fires hidden beneath the canopy, he would speak softly to the frightened and the weary, offering encouragement, reminding them of the justice they sought, and urging them to hold on to hope even when it seemed impossible. British, recognizing the extraordinary threat Tacky posed, escalated their efforts. Soldiers moved in coordinated groups, using both brute force and psychological terror to try to root out the rebels. They burned crops to deprive Tacky's followers of sustenance, set traps along likely escape routes, and interrogated captured slaves with brutality designed to extract information. The message was clear. The rebellion must be crushed, and all who followed it punished. The scale of the response underscored just how extraordinary Tacky's uprising had been. No single enslaved person had ever, in living memory, dared to strike so decisively against so many masters. He had become a living threat to the very structure of power in Jamaica. Yet the rebellion continued. Tacky had learned that fear alone could not dominate those who had tasted the sweetness of agency, even briefly. Each successful escape, each strategic ambush, reinforced the belief among his followers that they were more than slaves. They were men and women capable of shaping their destiny. They moved like shadows through the hills, striking when necessary, disappearing before the colonial troops could respond. Tacky's knowledge of the terrain, combined with the courage of his followers, created a sense of invincibility that belied the danger they faced. And yet, beneath every moment of triumph, there was a persistent awareness of mortality. Death was never far behind Dot in the midst of this ongoing struggle. Tacky's leadership was tested in ways he had not anticipated. Disagreements arose among his followers. Some wanted to strike again, to extend the rebellion further. Others argued for retreat, for patience. Tacky listened, weighed the opinions, and made decisions that balanced the desire for action with the imperative of survival. He was not a man seeking glory. He was a man seeking justice, guiding his people through a storm of fear, violence, and uncertainty. Every choice carried consequences, and he bore the burden of those consequences with a solemn determination that inspired loyalty. The psychological weight of the rebellion was immense. Even as they avoided capture, Tacky and his followers were haunted by the violence they had enacted. The bodies of the plantation masters remained a grim reminder of the cost of oppression, and yet the bloodshed weighed heavily on the consciences of those who had wielded machetes in revenge. Tacky understood this deeply. He did not glorify the killing. He framed it as a necessary act, a reclamation of power stolen for generations. In quiet moments, he spoke to his followers of their ancestors, of the resilience and courage that ran through their veins, reminding them that their actions were part of a larger struggle for justice. Despite the looming threat of the British, moments of humanity emerged amidst the chaos. Tacky's followers shared stories, sang songs that connected them to Africa, and tended to the sick and wounded. Even in flight, they sought to preserve the bonds that had been tested under slavery's cruelty. In these acts, they reclaimed a sense of community and identity that the plantations had tried to erase. The rebellion was not just about attacking the oppressors. It was about asserting their humanity in a world that had denied it. As the rebellion wore on, colonial forces began to adapt. Troops became more cunning, employing local knowledge to anticipate Tacky's movements. They established blockades along key passes, hoping to trap the rebels in the rugged interior. They sent spies among the enslaved population, offering promises of freedom in exchange for information. The pressure mounted relentlessly, and Tacky's followers grew weary, but Tacky remained steadfast. His courage and determination became a beacon, sustaining the morale of those around him. He reminded them that resistance, even when perilous, was a statement that could never be erased. The climactic confrontations drew near. Tacky understood that the rebellion could not last indefinitely in the face of superior firepower and relentless pursuit. Yet he refused to surrender or retreat. In fear, each encounter with the colonial forces was a battle of strategy and cunning. Ambushes were set, decoys employed, and the terrain leveraged to the fullest. Every engagement was a testament to the ingenuity and courage of the rebels. The British may have had numbers, weapons, and organization, but Tacky had knowledge, determination, and an unbreakable will. Through it all, the emotional toll weighed heavily. Every loss of life among his followers was felt deeply. The grief of mothers who lost children, of husbands who lost wives, of friends who fell in ambush was a constant shadow over Tacky's conscience. Yet the rebellion pressed on, fueled by the belief that their struggle, however costly, mattered. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the enslaved had seized a moment of agency, a moment to strike back at generations of oppression. Tacky's leadership had transformed fear into courage, despair into action, and oppression into defiance. By the end of this period of relentless pursuit, Tacky's legend had grown. To the British, he was a dangerous insurgent, a threat that demanded total eradication. To the enslaved, he was a hero, a symbol of the possibility of freedom, a man who had dared to act when the world told him he could not. Every victory, every narrow escape, every act of cunning and courage contributed to a story that would be whispered among the enslaved for years to come. Tacky's rebellion had become more than an event. It had become a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be crushed. The rebellion that Tacky had ignited burned with an intensity that could not last forever. The British forces had regrouped, their response calculated and merciless. Militias scoured the hills, setting traps along every path, blockading rivers, and stationing soldiers at the edges of villages. The enslaved who had once fled with Tacky now found themselves increasingly hemmed in, their movements restricted by the relentless pursuit. The mountains and forests, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. Yet Tacky pressed onward, every step guided by his unbreakable resolve, every decision weighed with the lives of those who had trusted him. The rebels were weary. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, fatigue pulled at their bodies, and fear whispered constantly in their ears. Children clung to parents, their small hands trembling. The elders stumbled, their steps slow and heavy. Tacky moved among them, offering encouragement, tending to wounds, listening to fears. He carried the weight of leadership as both a shield and a burden, knowing that every misstep could mean the end of the rebellion and perhaps the end of many lives. But he refused to let despair take root. He reminded them that their courage had already rewritten the rules of their world, that the act of defiance itself had changed the course of history. The climactic confrontations came swiftly. The British had learned from earlier failures and approached with overwhelming force, hoping to trap the rebels in a narrow valley where escape would be impossible. But Tacky's knowledge of the land was unmatched. He anticipated the maneuver, guiding his followers along hidden passes, crossing streams and ridges that the soldiers could not navigate. In these moments, his brilliance as a strategist became apparent. Each skirmish, each narrow escape, was executed with precision, a testament to the courage, skill, and resilience of the men and women he led. Yet the human toll continued to mount. Friends and family members fell in ambushes or were captured and executed by the colonial forces. The sound of gunfire and the cries of the wounded became constant companions. Tacky witnessed these losses with a grief that weighed heavily on him. Each death was a reminder of the cruelty of the system he had challenged, and each one steeled his determination to continue. In the moments between danger, he spoke to his followers of honor, of justice, and of the ancestors whose strength flowed through their veins. He reminded them that their struggle, however costly, was not in vain. Despite his careful planning, the forces arrayed against Tacky were too vast. Slowly, the circle of safety shrank. Villages were fortified, rivers patrolled, and hills scoured. The British knew that capturing Tacky would crush the rebellion entirely. And yet, even as the net tightened, his presence inspired those around him. The courage he had shown, the defiance he had embodied, had become a rallying point. Every rebel who survived felt that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a fight that transcended the fear and cruelty of the moment. The final confrontation came as the sun rose over a rugged ridge, casting long shadows across the hills. Tacky and his closest followers had been tracked to a narrow valley, their escape routes cut off. The British forces advanced with overwhelming numbers, their rifles raised, their swords gleaming in the morning light. The moment was tense, almost surreal. Tacky surveyed the scene, recognizing that the rebellion he had led might soon be crushed. Yet he did not waver. He raised his machete, signaling to his followers to prepare, and they stood shoulder to shoulder. United in defiance, the battle was fierce and brief. The rebels fought with the desperation of those who had already tasted freedom and refused to surrender it. Tacky led with courage that seemed larger than life, cutting through the advancing lines, shielding the weak, inspiring the strong. The clash echoed through the valley, a cacophony of screams, metal, and the shouts of men and women determined to fight against centuries of oppression. But numbers, discipline, and firepower told their story. Slowly, the rebels were overwhelmed. One by one they fell, captured or killed, their bodies strewn across the uneven ground. Tacky's final moments were marked by both heroism and inevitability. He fought to the end, a whirlwind of determination and fury, refusing to surrender to the forces that sought to crush him. When he was finally brought down, it was not by cowardice or hesitation, but by the sheer weight of the enemy arrayed against him. His death, though tragic, became a symbol. Those who witnessed it, who remembered his bravery and leadership, carried forward the story of a man who had dared to strike at the heart of oppression, who had led his people in a struggle that would echo for generations. In the aftermath, the British exacted their revenge with brutality. Captured rebels were executed, others were whipped, and the plantations were reinforced with even stricter control. Yet the rebellion could not be erased. Stories of Tacky's courage and leadership spread across Jamaica and beyond, whispered among enslaved populations, recounted in hushed tones by those who remembered the fire that had swept through the cane fields. Though the rebellion had been crushed, The spark it ignited endured. The legacy of Tacky's rebellion was profound. It revealed the vulnerabilities of the colonial system, the extraordinary courage of the enslaved, and the power of human determination in the face of overwhelming oppression. For future generations, Tacky became more than a man. He became a symbol of resistance, of the unquenchable desire for freedom, and of the moral truth that no system, no matter how cruel, could entirely extinguish the human spirit. Even centuries later, the story resonates. It speaks to the bravery of those who dared to defy injustice, to the cost of freedom, and to the enduring power of courage and leadership. Tacky's rebellion reminds us that acts of defiance, no matter how fleeting in their immediate success, can shape history, inspire generations, and remind us of the unbreakable dignity of those who fight for what is right. The blood spilled on that Easter dawn was tragic, but it was also a testament to a truth that no whip, no gun, no chain could ever erase. The human spirit will always seek freedom, and some souls are destined to become legends.